There's a smell to a Sudanese military detention facility that you don't forget ever. It's a combination of things: heat and sweat and human waste and rust and damp concrete that hasn't dried since the last rainy season. It gets into your clothes and your hair and your skin, and even years later, when you catch a whiff of something close to it, some combination of industrial oil and body odor in a hot, enclosed space, your body goes cold. Not from fear, from memory, from the part of your brain that kept you alive, filing away every sensory detail in case you need it again. Before I get into this story, I want to take a moment and say something to every one of you who has been watching, sharing, and supporting this channel. It means more than you know. These stories deserve to be told, and the fact that you're here listening to them, that matters to Billy. If you want to go deeper, hear more of these operations, more of these missions that history has largely forgotten, I invite you to join me over on Patreon. The link is below. Every bit of support keeps these stories coming. Now, back to Khartoum. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. This was not a Hollywood prison break. There was no pre-planned extraction, no team waiting outside the wire with a vehicle and a clean set of clothes, no radio that miraculously worked in the basement of a concrete building. What there was Billy, one man, locked in a cell in Khartoum in the late 80s with the Sudanese military's internal security apparatus, very much interested in who he was and what he was doing on their soil. And what there was, in addition to Billy, was time. Time to think, time to watch, time to learn the rhythms of a place that wanted to keep me locked down indefinitely. You want to know how I got out? I'll tell you, every bit of it. But you need to understand how I got in first, because the entry into that situation is as instructive as the exit. Maybe more so. I had been operating in Sudan since the early 80s, moving in and out under a cover that fit the environment. I was working as a water systems infrastructure consultant, representing a European-backed development organization that was conducting feasibility assessments for rural water access projects across the northeastern corridor. It was a good cover. The region was full of development workers, NGO consultants, engineers from a dozen different countries, all of them moving through Khartoum and out to the provinces with their clipboards and their Land Cruisers and their letters of introduction from various ministries. You could go almost anywhere with that cover if you carried the right documentation and behaved like someone genuinely interested in boreholes and pump capacities. My actual work was different. I was there on a specific task in gathering intelligence on the movement of Soviet-supplied materiel through the country, assessing relationships between the Khartoum regime and certain external actors who were using Sudan as a transit corridor, and making and maintaining contact with a network of sources that had been built carefully over several years of patient work. Sudan in the 80s was a complicated place. Nimari's government had been overthrown in 1985, and what replaced it was a transitional civilian administration that was itself under constant pressure from military factions, Islamist movements, and the ongoing civil war in the south. There were a lot of players, a lot of competing interests, and a lot of people watching other people. That last part is what mattered to me. The surveillance had been building for about 3 weeks before the arrest. I could feel it. You develop a sense for that kind of thing when you've operated in denied areas long enough. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. The same face appearing in different locations. A vehicle that parks too conveniently. A reaction time that's a beat too fast when you change your route. I'd been varying my patterns, sanitizing my meetings, running counter-surveillance routes through the Omdurman souk that should have been clean, should have been. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known at that point, was that one of my secondary sources had been rolled up by the Internal Security Directorate about 10 days prior. He'd held for a while. Long enough for me to believe I was still clean, but not long enough They came for me at about 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, as best I can reconstruct it. I was at my office space, a small room I rented in a building near the Blue Nile Sailing Club that I used for the cover work, maintaining the fiction of the water systems consultancy with enough paper trail to satisfy a casual look. 2 men came through the door, and one stayed in the doorway. They were plain clothes, but they moved like military, and the way they positioned themselves in the room, one cutting off my access to the window, one staying between me and the only exit, told me everything I needed to know about who they were and what this was. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a check on my documentation. This was a hard takedown, clean and professional, by people who'd done it before. There was a brief conversation in Arabic. My Arabic was serviceable, not fluent, but enough to follow the substance of what was being said. They identified themselves as representing the Military Intelligence Directorate. They told me I was to come with them. They told me my documentation would be reviewed. They were polite, the way you can afford to be polite when you're holding all the cards. I went with them. You do the math in those moments fast, and the math told me that resistance was not the play. There were 3 of them. I was unarmed, and making a scene in broad daylight in a city where I was operating undercover was exactly the kind of thing that would blow the entire operation and compromise every source I had in country. So I went. I kept my face neutral and my hands visible, and I went and I started the clock in my head, because from the moment they put me in that vehicle, the work of getting out had begun. The vehicle was a military-issue truck, canvas covered in the back, the kind the Sudanese army used throughout its logistics and transport network. I was not blindfolded, which was interesting. It suggested either that they didn't particularly care whether I learned the route, or that they were confident enough in the security of the destination that it didn't matter. I watched what I could through the canvas gap at the rear. We drove roughly north and then east from the central city area, crossed the Blue Nile on the Khartoum North Bridge, and continued for maybe another 20 minutes before turning into a compound through a gated entrance. I logged the time, the general direction, the approximate distance, all of it went into the mental map. The facility they took me to was on the outskirts of the city, not the main military installation, but a smaller compound that the security directorate used for what I'll call sensitive detentions. It had a processing area, a series of administrative offices, and a detention block that held maybe 20 cells. My cell was toward the end of the block. Concrete floor, concrete walls, a single barred window set high in the wall that let in light but not air, a metal door with a sliding observation panel, a drain in the floor that served as a sanitary facility, no furniture, no mattress, 1 bucket, 1 metal cup, and, as I would discover during the first meal delivery, 1 spoon. That spoon was going to become the most important object in my world for the next several weeks. The processing had taken the better part of an afternoon. Fingerprints, photographs, an inventory of my personal effects, the items that constituted my cover identity, were handled carefully, set aside rather than disposed of, which told me they were being examined for intelligence value. They took my watch, my wallet, my cover documents. They left me the clothes I was standing in. A guard I hadn't seen before walked me to the cell block, opened the door, and that was that. The sound of the lock engaging behind me was a particular kind of sound, definitive, mechanical, final. I stood in the middle of the cell for a moment, not frozen, never frozen, but taking a breath and letting the situation settle into its actual dimensions. This was the situation. This was what I had to work with. Now begin. The first thing you do when they lock the door is you don't panic. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford, and it contributes nothing to the problem. What you do is you work. You work the problem systematically, and you start with what you have, which in my case was a functional brain, a trained body, and decades of operational experience that had put me in difficult situations before and brought me out the other side. I assessed the cell, every inch of it. I ran my hands along every wall, every joint, every surface. I examined the door, the hinges, the lock mechanism, the gap between the door and the frame. I looked at the window for a long time, ran through what I knew about the layout of the block from the walk and the number of steps, the turns, the sounds, the guards I had seen and their positioning. I mapped the place in my head as completely as I could. From the information available, the window was out, too small, too high, and it opened. I could see the mechanism onto what sounded like an interior courtyard that had foot traffic on a regular basis. The metal bars were set into a poured concrete surround and showed no signs of corrosion at the base. The frame was solid. Even if a man could somehow get through those bars and squeeze through that gap, he'd drop into a lit courtyard with active foot traffic and nowhere to go. Scratch the window. The door was solid. The lock was a pin tumbler mechanism based on what I could see of the keyhole, but without tools, it was not a realistic avenue. The hinges were on the exterior side of the door, which is standard in detention facilities for exactly the reason you'd think. I ran my fingernails along the doorframe gap on the latch side and felt the slight irregularity in the fitted gap that widened slightly toward the bottom. Filed that away. Not useful yet, but filed. The floor drain I examined carefully. The grate was cast iron, seated in a recessed collar. Below it, darkness and the smell of whatever the drain connected to. I pulled at the grate. It moved loose in the collar, not cemented or bolted. I lifted it. The drain opening was maybe 6 inches in diameter. No human being was going anywhere through a 6-inch drain, and the infrastructure below was not something I could determine without light or tools. Replaced the grate exactly as I'd found it. The ceiling was approximately 10 feet high. Poured concrete, no visible access panels. A single bare bulb in a wire cage recessed into the ceiling, controlled from outside the cell. The guards turned it off at what I estimated was around 9 in the evening and back on at 6 in the morning. That light cycle gave me the basic framework of their operational day. I noted all of this, and I moved on, because the point of the initial assessment is not to find an immediate solution. It's to understand what you're working with. The solution comes later, when you've gathered enough information to work with intelligently. The guard rotations told me a great deal. I spent the first 5 days doing nothing but observation, eating what they brought me, doing my physical maintenance, and watching and listening with complete focus. There were 2 shifts, a day shift that ran from roughly 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, and a night shift that covered the rest. Day shift had 4 guards working the block. Night shift had 2. Guard change happened at both transition points, and there was a period of maybe 15 minutes during each change where the overlap between the outgoing and incoming guards created a natural degradation in observation. The outgoing guards were mentally already out the door, and the incoming guards hadn't fully locked in yet. 15 minutes, twice daily. I filed that away. Meals came twice a day, once in the mid-morning, once in the early evening. The food was military ration quality flatbread, a legume stew that varied slightly in composition, occasionally some rice, water. It was adequate. Not pleasant, but adequate, and I ate everything because maintaining my physical condition was a priority, and caloric intake was part of that. 2 guards for meal delivery. One stayed at the cell door while the other slid the tray through a slot at the bottom of the door. The slot was approximately 4 inches high by about 14 inches wide. Too small for anything useful in terms of direct egress, but significant for reasons I'd get to. I studied the guards individually, learned their routines, their habits, their tendencies. The senior guard on the day shift, a sergeant, based on his bearing and the deference he received from the others, was a professional. Alert, methodical, not prone to unnecessary conversation or distraction. The others were younger, less experienced. The one I'd think of as the youngest had a habit of spending his observation panel checks as quickly as possible, barely a glance before sliding the panel shut. The one I'd think of as the careful one was the opposite. He'd hold the panel open longer and actually look into the cell, not just perform the check. I adapted my behavior accordingly. When the careful one was on panel duty, I was always positioned doing something mundane, sitting, eating, appearing to rest. Nothing to see here. The interrogation started on the second day. There were 3 of them over the first week, conducted by a senior officer whose name I never learned, a man in his late 40s, heavy-set, with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who'd been doing this a long time and wasn't in a hurry. He was good. Spoke reasonable English, was not abusive, not physically, anyway, and asked intelligent questions. He asked about my work, about the organization I claimed to represent, about my travel history, about specific individuals whose names he had clearly gotten from my compromised source. I stayed in cover. Every answer I gave was consistent with the documentation I'd been carrying, consistent with the legend I'd been operating under, consistent with the specific details I'd rehearsed and memorized as part of the cover development, a water systems consultant from a development NGO doing field work in the Northeastern Corridor. I had project reports. I had correspondence with the relevant ministry offices. I had a history that could be checked and would check out to a certain depth. The question was whether that depth was enough and how long they were going to keep pulling on the thread before they either accepted the cover or moved to harder methods of verification. I needed to be out before they moved to harder methods. The walk to interrogation was itself valuable intelligence. 2 guards escorting, one in front and one behind, hands cuffed in front of me with a standard military restraint. The route took me through the main corridor of the block, through a security door at the block entrance, down a covered walkway to the administrative building, and into a room on the 2nd floor that was set up as an interrogation space table, chairs, a window overlooking the interior courtyard. Those walks gave me something I badly needed, confirmation of the facility's internal geography. I counted everything. Steps from my cell to the block exit, steps along the covered walkway, the number of doors between the block entrance and the exterior, the positions of any guards I could see during the transit, the layout of the courtyard, which was indeed lit and had regular foot traffic during daytime hours, which confirmed that the window egress I'd ruled out in the initial assessment was correctly ruled out. Each walk added detail to the map in my head. What I saw on the 3rd interrogation transit was particularly useful. As we crossed the covered walkway, I had a clear line of sight to the eastern perimeter wall. It was approximately 150 meters from the block entrance. At the eastern end of the wall, where it met a utility structure, what looked like a transformer housing the wall profile changed. The utility structure was set against the exterior face of the wall, which meant the wall's interior face in that area was relatively unobstructed, and the shadow cast by the transformer housing at night would be significant. More importantly, I could see that the top of the wall in that section lacked the glass or wire I could see on other sections. The eastern corner was a comparatively soft point. I logged that. Everything went into the mental map. Between interrogations, I had nothing but time, and I used it the way I'd been trained to use it productively. I exercised. I ran through everything I knew about the facility. I thought through every option available to me, no matter how impractical it seemed on first pass, because dismissing options too quickly is how you miss the one that works. I thought about my sources and which of them, if any, might have channels to get word to the right people about my situation. I thought about the timeline, how long before someone on my side noticed I was dark, how long before they acted on that, how long before any action they took could realistically produce results on the ground. The answers to those questions were not encouraging. The operational security protocols that existed for a reason meant that my absence would be noticed, but it would be noticed on a schedule, not immediately. And any official inquiry would likely accelerate the Sudanese security apparatus's decision-making about what to do with me, not slow it down. The cavalry was not coming fast enough to change my situation. I needed to change it myself. And that's when I started thinking seriously about the spoon. It was a standard issue metal spoon, not particularly heavy, not particularly light, stamped steel, the kind of thing you'd find in any institutional setting, a military mess hall, a school canteen, a detention facility. It had a bowl, a neck, a handle. It was approximately 7 inches long. It was the only implement I had been given. I had been spending a lot of time examining the feed slot in the door. The slot was used to deliver the meal tray and retrieve the empty one. During delivery, one side of the slot's lip was engaged by the tray itself, which kept it from closing fully. The slot was on a spring mechanism. It was held closed by spring tension, opened by pushing the tray through from outside, and would close again once the tray was retrieved. Standard institutional design. What I'd noticed over days of careful observation was that the spring mechanism had a specific behavior. When the slot opened fully, when the tray was being pushed through, there was a moment where the spring was at maximum compression and the latch that held the slot closed was temporarily disengaged, and the latch itself was a simple pivoting bar on the interior side of the slot housing. I could see it if I lay flat on the floor and looked at the slot from the right angle. The latch was not the lock. Let me be clear about that. The latch on the slot was separate from the main door lock. What the slot latch controlled was the slot itself, whether it stayed closed between meal deliveries or could be manipulated. If I could engage that latch mechanism from the inside during a meal delivery, you could hook it in the open position. I could use the slot to access the exterior mechanism on the door during the window when the guard stepped away. It sounds complicated. In practice, it was a matter of geometry and patience. I spent considerable time studying that latch through every meal delivery. I had to be subtle about it lying flat on the floor to observe the slot mechanism. It was the kind of behavior that, if noticed through the observation panel, would raise questions. I chose my observation windows carefully. The morning meal delivery was conducted by the younger guard and the careful one on alternating days. On the younger guard's days, when his panel check was perfunctory, I could spend more time in a position on the floor. On the careful one's days, I was more conservative. I built up my understanding of the mechanism incrementally over about a week of careful observation until I was confident I understood exactly how it worked and exactly what I needed to do to engage it. Now I spent 3 days working on the spoon. Using the edge of the metal cup and the rough concrete floor, I worked the handle of the spoon slowly, very slowly, in measured sessions, timed to the moments when the observation panel was closed, bending and reshaping the handle to create a hook profile. The steel was not hardened. It was soft enough to work with sustained effort, too hard to bend with bare hands but workable against concrete. I hid the work during observation panel checks by lying on the spoon with my body pretending to sleep. I worked in short sessions, always alert for the sound of footsteps in the corridor. The work was tedious and the progress was slow. Slow is fine, slow is acceptable. Slow means you're not making noise and you're not being seen and you're still in business. The temptation in any confined environment is to rush to feel the urgency of the situation, pushing you toward faster action, shorter timelines, more risk. That temptation is a killer. You manage it by focusing on the immediate task in front of you, not on the larger timeline. Right now, the task is this bend in this metal, do it right, do it completely, move to the next thing when this thing is done. After 3 days, I had something that looked less like a spoon and more like a flat, elongated hook. The bowl of the spoon was still intact at the end. I needed that for the actual manipulation. The handle had been bent roughly 90 degrees, about 2 inches from the bowl, creating a shallow hook that could, in theory, engage a simple pivoting latch. The next question was timing. The meal delivery window was my operational window. During delivery, both guards were present, one at the door, one handling the tray. The slot opened. The guard stepped away once the tray was through because there was nothing useful to watch while a prisoner ate. The other guard usually moved a few steps down the corridor, staying close but not directly observing my door. I had maybe 2 to 3 minutes between tray delivery and the guard's return to retrieve the empty tray. 2 to 3 minutes. That was my operational timeline. I ran the manipulation mentally dozens of times before I attempted it physically. Visualized the geometry. Visualized the latch position. Visualized exactly how to angle the modified spoon through the slot to engage the latch while it was in the open position. This kind of mental preparation is not optional. It is absolutely critical, because when you are actually doing the thing, your hands need to move on autopilot. Your conscious mind needs to stay on the security situation, on listening for footsteps, on monitoring the observation panel. The physical action has to be rehearsed to the point where it's automatic. On the 4th day, after I'd finished modifying the spoon, during the morning meal delivery, I did it. The tray came through. The slot opened. I waited 1 breath, 2, until the tray was fully inside and I heard the guard's footsteps move away from the door. Then I was on the floor, flat, the modified spoon in my right hand, moving the hook toward the slot. The latch was exactly where I'd mapped it. The angle was close to what I'd rehearsed, but not identical. There was a small gap between the housing and the latch bar that I hadn't fully accounted for. I had to adjust. Adjusting took time. Time I didn't have to waste. The hook went in. I felt it contact the latch bar. I applied lateral pressure, gentle, controlled, because the worst thing I could do was snap the spoon at the hook joint I'd created. The latch moved. I felt it pivot. I held it in position and moved my body angle to use the spoon's leverage to hold it there. The slot stayed open, barely, a gap of maybe half an inch, where the spring tension should have closed it, but open. I retrieved the spoon, moved back against the wall, and ate the meal. Listened. Nobody came. The slot stayed in its partially open position. I'd successfully engaged the latch. When the guards returned for the tray, I watched carefully. The guard tried the slot. It was stiffer than normal because of the latch position. He pushed it. It gave. He retrieved the tray, and the slot closed. He didn't investigate. Why would he? Nothing about the interaction triggered concern, but I now knew the geometry worked. I knew the timing was viable. What I needed next was to address the door itself. Here is what I knew about the door lock from sustained observation. The lock was operated by a key from the outside. From the inside, there was no mechanism. It was locked, period, and that was by design. However, the door itself had a characteristic that I'd noted during my first week. The fit between the door and the frame was not tight. There was a gap, maybe a 1/4 inch along the latch side where the frame had shifted slightly, probably from the seasonal expansion and contraction of the concrete in Khartoum's temperature swings. That gap was consistent from the bottom of the door to roughly 3 feet up, then narrowed. A 1/4 inch gap was not enough to do anything useful with a spoon in its current modified form, but it was enough to insert a strip of material. I had 2 things I could work with for material. The first was the canvas strap from the water bottle. I'd been given a military issue metal canteen with a canvas carrying strap about 1 inch wide and roughly 18 inches long. The second was the hem of my shirt, which I'd been wearing since the arrest. The shirt was a heavy cotton weave, and the hem was a double layer that, once unpicked, gave me a strip of material about 3/4 of an inch wide and maybe 24 inches long. Unpicking the hem was done over 2 nights, using my fingernails and, in the tighter sections, the edge of the spoon bowl as a seam ripper. Slow, careful work done in darkness. After the cell light went off, which was actually preferable, the darkness covered what I was doing, and it trained my fingers to work by feel alone, which was going to be important later when I needed to work at the door gap in dim conditions. The door lock's latch bolt, the spring-loaded component that held the door closed when not deadlocked, was what I needed to manipulate. If the bolt could be compressed, the door could swing open. The deadlock, if engaged, would prevent that. The question was whether the guards were using the deadlock. Here's what I'd observed. During interrogations, when the guards moved me from the cell to the interrogation room, the door was locked on the way out. On the return, I'd been paying close attention to the sound of the lock, the number of turns, the engagement sequence. The deadlock had a distinct double click when it engaged. I had heard the single click of the latch bolt being thrown, but I had not once in 2 weeks, heard the double click of the deadlock being engaged when the guards secured the cell after a routine check or meal delivery. Only during my movement to and from interrogation did I hear the full sequence. They weren't deadlocking me in during routine intervals. They were relying on the primary latch. That was a security failure on their part, a significant one. Military installations fall into predictable patterns, and the people staffing them follow procedures until the procedures become thoughtless habit, and at that point the procedure stops being security and starts being motion. The guards locking my door after meal delivery were not thinking about whether to use the deadlock. They were turning the key the way they always turned the key, which was the single turn, because that's what routine had made automatic. Nobody had assessed the risk of that shortcut. Nobody had corrected it. In a properly run facility, use of the deadlock would be standing operating procedure, mandatory, checked, enforced. In this facility, it was optional, and nobody was making it non-optional. Their negligence was my avenue out. The latch bolt manipulation technique is not complicated in principle. You insert a flexible strip of material into the gap between the door and the frame at the latch height. Angle it so that it contacts the angled face of the latch bolt and apply sustained downward pressure. The angled face of the bolt is designed to allow the door to close. It compresses the bolt as the door swings shut against that angle. The same principle works in reverse. If you can apply force in the right direction through the gap, the bolt compresses, the door opens. The difficulty is that you need to know exactly where the latch bolt is located, the precise height, the precise inset from the face of the door, and you need enough material length and flexibility to work effectively through a 1/4-inch gap without the strip breaking or slipping. I spent 4 days on the preparation before I was ready to attempt the main effort. I'd identified the latch bolt height by running the cup along the door at the frame gap and listening and feeling for the point where resistance increased where the bolt was sitting behind the frame. I'd prepared the material strip from the shirt hem, reinforcing it at the working end by folding and twisting it to increase its stiffness where it needed to apply force. I'd practiced the insertion angle against the wall of the cell repeatedly until the motion was automatic. I want to stop here and tell you about the evenings, because I think people imagine that an experience like this is all intense focus and dramatic preparation, and in reality, it is mostly grinding sameness punctuated by moments of actual work. The evenings after the light went off, before sleep came, those were their own kind of test. You lie in a concrete cell in the dark with the heat still sitting in the walls from the day's sun, and the sounds of the city at night are coming from somewhere you can't see, and your mind wants to go to places you can't afford to let it go. You start thinking about timelines, about what happens if this doesn't work, about the people you know and whether any of them are taking steps on your behalf and what those steps might be, about the interrogations and whether the cover is holding and for how long. You have to manage that. You have to develop a mental discipline that is separate from the physical discipline, and in some ways harder. The physical discipline is about doing the right things. The mental discipline is about not doing the wrong things, not catastrophizing, not chasing anxiety loops that burn energy and produce nothing, not allowing the confinement and the uncertainty to hollow you out gradually from the inside. I dealt with it by running operational problems in my head like I was sitting in a planning room, reviewing what I'd learned that day, thinking through the next steps, sometimes just running through operational knowledge I'd accumulated over the years, reviewing languages, reviewing geographical knowledge, reviewing the details of operations I'd run in other theaters, keeping the mind active and pointed forward rather than inward. That discipline is not something you develop when you're in the cell. You either have it before you get there or you don't. You build it over years of operating in conditions that demand mental control reconnaissance missions where impatience will get you killed. Surveillance operations, where hours of stillness are required before a single action. Training regimens that push you past the point where your mind starts looking for reasons to stop. The capacity for sustained mental discipline in extreme conditions is not natural. It is trained. And if you haven't trained it, the walls of a cell will find that out about you in very short order. My window was the night shift guard change. Night shift, 2 guards, and the change happened at around midnight. I'd timed it over many nights by the sounds of the shift change procedures, the keys, the voices, the footsteps moving away from the block. The incoming guards took approximately 12 minutes to complete their initial sweep of the block before settling into their station position near the block entrance. After the initial sweep, they checked cells on a rotation, not constant observation, but periodic passes every 30 to 40 minutes. I needed to be through the door and out of the cell block before the incoming guards completed their first pass. I had maybe 8 minutes from the moment the outgoing guards cleared the block to the moment the incoming guards would complete their first pass and potentially look through my observation panel. 8 minutes. 8 minutes to get through the door, move down the corridor, exit the block, cross the compound, and get over that wall. That's aggressive. That is an aggressive timeline for a man who doesn't know exactly what he'll find on the other side of each door or in each section of the compound. But it was workable if everything moved cleanly, and the preparation I'd done was precisely designed to make everything move cleanly. I waited for the right night. Not the first available opportunity, but the right one. I wanted a night when the conditions were optimal, when the outgoing guards were tired and moving quickly through their end-of-shift procedures, when the incoming guards were dealing with something that slowed their sweep. I watched and I waited and I was patient, because patience is not weakness and it is not passivity. Patience in an operational context is active. It is the deliberate conservation of your effort and risk tolerance for the moment when conditions are maximally favorable. That night came on what I estimated was the 23rd day of my detention. The conditions were right. The outgoing shift had been running a tighter schedule than usual. There had been some kind of administrative activity earlier in the day that had created a backlog, and the guards were moving fast through their end-of-shift procedures. The incoming pair, I'd identified them by their voices and footfall patterns over weeks of listening, were the two I thought of as the slower pair. One of them had a limp that slightly impaired his walking pace. The other was a young soldier who tended to move carefully and deliberately rather than quickly. At approximately 11:30 that night, I heard the shift change begin. Keys, voices, the administrative exchange at the duty station. The outgoing shift moved through the block quickly. I heard each observation panel open and close in sequence down the corridor, the guards doing their final check before signing off. My panel opened, stayed open for maybe 3 seconds, closed, done. The sound of the outgoing guards moving toward the block exit. The exterior door, silence. I was already moving. The material strip was in my right hand. I went to the door and found the gap already familiar to my fingertips in the dark and inserted the strip at the precise height I'd mapped. The angle was critical. Too steep, and the strip would fold against the frame without contacting the bolt face. Too shallow, and it would slide past without applying force. I'd found the angle in rehearsal. I applied it now. I felt the resistance when the strip contacted the bolt. Applied pressure, downward and lateral simultaneously, drawing the strip along the bolt face. The bolt compressed, partially, not fully. I held the pressure, adjusted the angle by a fraction, and felt the bolt compress further. The door moved, a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, The latch bolt was fully compressed, and the door was swinging on its hinges away from the frame. I pushed it open carefully, controlling the speed, because the last thing I needed was the sound of a door swinging hard against a wall, stepped through, and pressed it back into the closed position behind me. The spring on the latch seated the bolt again. To any casual observation, the door looked closed and locked. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent light at the far end of the block was lit, but the nearer section was dim. I had my bearings from the walks to interrogation. I knew the layout. The block exit was to my left, approximately 40 feet. The duty station for the night guards was beyond that, around a corner and approximately 60 feet further. Beyond the duty station was an administrative section, and beyond that, the vehicle gate. I moved left, fast but controlled. No running. Running makes sound, and it makes you look wrong if anyone catches a glimpse. I moved at the pace of someone who belonged there, which is a skill that takes time to develop, but which matters enormously in denied area work. You move with purpose. You do not look at things you're not supposed to know about. Your body language communicates authorization. The block exit was a heavy door with a push bar. I pushed it slowly, controlling the motion. It opened onto a covered walkway between the block and the administrative building, empty. The night air hit me warm and dry, the particular dryness of a Khartoum night, and I oriented myself by the sky. Clear night, excellent star coverage. I could place my compass heading from the stars, which I'd been tracking through the cell window for weeks. North was confirmed. The vehicle gate was to my north-northwest, roughly 150 meters across the compound. I scanned the compound. One guard visible at the vehicle gate, the glow of a cigarette marking his position from about 150 meters. No visible patrol between me and the eastern wall. The compound lighting was functional but not comprehensive. There were pools of shadow between the building perimeter and the wall, created by the building's own roof lines blocking the perimeter lights. I could work with that, but there was an intermediate problem I hadn't been able to fully assess from my cell or from the interrogation walks. Between the covered walkway and the eastern wall section, there was an open area of packed earth about 60 meters wide. It was unlit except for the spillover from the perimeter lights, but 60 meters of open ground is 60 meters of exposure. Anyone looking from the gate guardhouse or from any of the administrative building windows that faced the compound interior could potentially see movement across that ground. I had two options. I could move directly across the open ground quickly, accepting the exposure, betting on the hour, and the guards' attention being elsewhere. Or I could go around the long way, staying close to the building perimeters where the shadows were better, adding significant time to my transit but reducing exposure. 8 minutes total. I'd spent 2 of them getting out of the cell and to this position. 6 remained. I went direct, fast, low, controlled. Crossed that open ground in what felt like a long time but was probably under 30 seconds, and reached the shadow along the eastern wall without incident. The gate guard's cigarette glow had not moved. Nobody had shouted, nobody had reacted. I was at the wall. The transformer housing was exactly where I'd mapped it from the interrogation walk, a concrete and metal structure about 6 feet high, set hard against the wall face. The wall above it was 10 feet high, block construction, with joints between the blocks that were recessed enough to provide finger purchase. I looked at it for 1 second. 1 second only. Then I went up. The first 4 feet were the transformer housing itself, which I scrambled up quickly, flat roof, enough friction on the surface to move fast. From the top of the housing to the top of the wall was another 4 feet of vertical block face. I found the first joint with my fingers, pulled, found the next, pulled again. The joints were shallower than I'd have liked, and my fingers were not at their best after 3 weeks in the cell. But the grip held and footholds held, and I went up, and I got to the top, and I looked over. The exterior side dropped to a packed earth area adjacent to what appeared to be a vehicle storage and maintenance compound, civilian-looking equipment, a couple of trucks, oil drums, no visible guards. The drop was about 12 feet to the ground. Not trivial. I controlled it, got my hands to the top of the wall, swung my legs over, lowered myself to arm's length and dropped, bent my knees on landing, rolled, and was up immediately and moving. The impact was harder than a clean drop from that height should have been. My legs had less spring in them after 3 weeks of limited movement than they would have at full conditioning, but nothing gave way and nothing made a noise it carried. I was in the shadow of the exterior wall now, inside the adjacent compound, moving along the wall face toward the gap I needed. The gap was where the perimeter fence of the adjacent compound met the exterior wall of the detention facility as a point where the fence had been run up to the wall without being properly tied in, leaving a space of maybe 8 inches between the fence post and the wall face, wide enough for a man to push through sideways. I'd mapped this during one of the interrogation transits when the route had taken us past a window with a longer sight line to the compound exterior. I was through it in seconds. On a public road, I stopped. 30 seconds of absolute stillness. Listened. No alarm, no shouts. The cigarette glow at the gate was still visible above the wall, still stationary. The adjacent compound was silent behind me. I was out. Being out of the facility was a beginning, not an end. I want you to understand that clearly, because there is a tendency to think of an escape as the conclusion of the story, when operationally it's closer to the transition between phases of a longer problem. I was out of the cell. I was still in Khartoum. I was still in Sudan. I was still on the wrong side of a border in a country whose military intelligence directorate was currently holding a file on me that they were about to discover had walked out of their detention block. The problem had changed in character, but it hadn't resolved. The first order of business was distance and direction. I moved north from the compound, staying off the main roads, using the smaller streets in the residential area that bordered the facility's neighborhood. Khartoum at that hour, I estimated, somewhere around 1 in the morning, was quiet but not completely empty. There is always some movement in a city of that size. Night shift workers, early risers, people moving for reasons of their own. I moved with them, not against them, adopting the pace and posture of someone making a routine transit rather than someone putting distance between himself and a military detention facility. My appearance was a problem. 3 weeks in a cell in the same clothes I'd been arrested in left me looking and smelling exactly like what I was, a man who had not had access to a shower or clean clothes in 3 weeks. In the dark, this was less of an issue. In daylight, it would be conspicuous. I needed to be somewhere secure and static before daylight because moving through the city in the daytime in my current condition was an unnecessary risk. I had a mental map of Khartoum that was reasonably detailed, built over months of operating in the city before the arrest, and reinforced by the walks to and from interrogation, which had given me compass-confirmable reference points. I knew the general direction and distance to the northern residential districts where one of my assets operated. Getting there on foot through back streets would take 3 to 4 hours. That put me arriving sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning before full daylight, which was acceptable. I moved. The route took me through several neighborhoods of varying character, working-class residential areas, a section of light commercial development near the Blue Nile waterfront, an older district of mud brick construction where the streets narrowed to lanes barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. I was careful at every road crossing, stopping well back from the intersection, looking both ways for any vehicle that moved with the deliberate pace of a patrol rather than normal traffic crossing when clean. Once, about an hour into the transit, a military vehicle came down a road I'd been about to cross. I stepped back into a doorway alcove and stayed still while it passed. It did not slow, did not stop, continued on its route. A routine patrol, almost certainly not a response to my escape, which couldn't have been discovered yet, but it was a reminder of what the environment was and to stay sharp. I reached the northern district well before dawn and found the dead drop location Mohammed and I had established. It was a specific location in the northern market district, a particular vendor's stall that when shuttered for the night, had a concealed gap behind a wooden panel on the rear face where small items and messages could be left and retrieved. The gap had been created deliberately, years before, as one of several contingency communication points we'd agreed on. I left the message. The format was a simple coded arrangement of small objects, a combination of stones and a fold of material placed in a specific configuration that communicated a specific message without using any words or writing. Mohammed knew the code. Anyone else who found the gap in its contents would find nothing intelligible. Then I needed to get off the street. 3 blocks from the market there was a small mosque that I knew stayed unlocked during the nighttime hours between prayers. I went in, found a corner of the prayer hall that was sufficiently shadowed, and sat down. Not a perfect safe haven by any measure, but acceptable for a few hours. The mosque had the advantage of being a place where a man sitting quietly in the early morning hours was not remarkable. Plenty of men arrived early for the dawn prayer. When the mosque began to fill before Fajr, the pre-dawn prayer, I joined the back rows without incident, performed the prayer motions I had learned years earlier from Sudanese contacts, and when the prayer concluded and the mosque began to clear, I moved with the dispersing congregation into the early morning street. The sun was just coming up. The city was waking, and I had a decision to make. Staying mobile was safer from a detection standpoint. A moving person is harder to surveil than a static one, but it increased exposure because my appearance remained a liability in daylight. Finding somewhere to wait for Mohammed's response was safer from an appearance standpoint, but riskier if anyone had started looking specifically in this neighborhood. I compromised. I moved to the market area, which was coming alive with the early morning commercial activity that characterizes Sudanese markets at that hour, and I worked the periphery, never stationary for long, always within sight of the dead drop location, always with multiple routes available if I needed to move quickly. At about 9 in the morning, 3 hours or so after I'd left the message, I saw Mohammed's nephew, a young man, maybe 20, moving through the market with the specific kind of purposeful casualness that you learn to recognize in people who are doing exactly what you're doing. Moving through an environment with a specific objective while appearing to have none, he was looking for me without looking for me. I let him come to within 20 meters of the dead drop location, and then made my presence known with a prearranged signal, a specific way of carrying a piece of cloth that I had torn from my shirt for exactly this purpose. He saw it, held his line for another 30 seconds, then altered his course and closed the distance. Brief exchange. No names, no extended conversation. He handed me a bundle of clothing, cash, a folded note with a location and a time written on it. The time was that evening. The location was a specific address in the Omdurman district across the White Nile. He was gone before I'd fully processed everything he'd given me. I moved to a public wash facility near the market, the kind of place where laborers and workers cleaned up before and after shifts for a small fee and paid for the use of a private washroom. Got clean, changed into the clothes Mohammed's nephew had brought, simple civilian clothes that fit well enough a style consistent with a Sudanese tradesman or minor clerk. The transformation from 3-week detainee to unremarkable urban figure was not complete, but it was sufficient. Sufficient was what I needed. The rest of that day I spent managing time and managing risk. I moved slowly through the city, never staying in one place for more than an hour, avoiding the routes I'd most frequently used during my operational period before the arrest. Those routes were potentially known to the Security Directorate's surveillance network. I ate from a street vendor, the first real food I'd had since the military ration meals in the cell, and the normalcy of sitting at a wooden table, eating full mid-aims with strangers on either side, was a particular kind of surreal. The city was operating, life was going on. 24 hours ago, I'd been in a concrete cell. Right now, I was eating breakfast in the sunshine. That contrasts the violence of the institutional world against the ordinary continuousness of civilian life is something that stays with you. The world doesn't stop while you're in the middle of something that feels like it should stop the world. The world keeps going. That is, in its way, a stabilizing fact. By early evening, I was in Omdurman at the address on the note, and the rest of the exfil was Mohammed's operation, not mine. Mohammed ran it cleanly. That evening, I was placed in the back of a truck, cargo concealment, well executed, the kind of hide that would survive a casual checkpoint inspection, and we moved east out of Omdurman toward the main road that runs northeast toward Kassala and ultimately Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. It is a long route, the better part of 500 kilometers of road that varies between rough paving and packed dirt through terrain that in the late 80s was periodically touched by the various civil conflicts that had been running through Sudan's interior since independence. Not a comfortable ride, not a fast one. We stopped twice at military checkpoints during the overnight transit. Both times I heard the exchange between Mohammed's driver and the checkpoint guards. Both times the truck was waved through after a document check and a brief visual inspection of the cargo, which was legitimately construction materials with me concealed in a void space in the load. The documents were good, the cover story was solid, the driver was experienced, the checkpoints cleared. By early the following morning, we were east of Kassala, in the region where the terrain begins to shift toward the Red Sea coast's drier, more broken landscape. Mohammed's network handed me off to a second contact somewhere in this area, a man whose role in the chain I didn't need to know and didn't ask about, professional courtesy. Compartmentalization serves everyone in these arrangements. The second leg of the journey took another several hours and put me in Port Sudan by late afternoon. Port Sudan is a functioning port city on the Red Sea, commercial activity, maritime traffic, the particular organized chaos of a working harbor. My contact there was a man connected to the maritime shipping community who facilitated the next step, which was a transit by small vessel north along the Red Sea coast and eventually to a third country port from which a more conventional extraction was possible. The maritime transit was its own experience. Small vessel, maybe 40 feet, working the coastal route in the way fishing and small cargo vessels have worked that coast for centuries. The Red Sea at that latitude is navigable but not forgiving short, steep swells when the wind gets up, treacherous shallows in areas, a temperature that in late afternoon can bake the deck metal hot enough to burn skin. I spent most of the transit below, which was better for concealment and marginally worse for everything else. We arrived at the third country port 2 days after leaving Port Sudan. From there, it was a matter of making contact with the right people through the right channels that exist for exactly this kind of situation, staffed by professionals who ask few questions and move quickly. Clean documentation, a flight out, and then I was on a plane, standard altitude and airspeed. Seat reclined, the first full sleep I'd had in a month, 26 days total, from the arrest in Khartoum to wheels up out of the region. 23 days in the cell, 1 night crossing the city and making contact, 2 days in the truck east, 2 days on the water, 26 days, and I was out the other side. There are things about that experience that I've carried with me ever since, and I want to share them with you now because they matter not just for people who might someday find themselves in a cell in Sudan, which is admittedly a specific situation, but for anyone who is locked inside something that is trying to keep them stuck. The spoon was always there. From the first meal delivery, on the first day of detention, that spoon was in my hand. What changed was not the spoon. What changed was my understanding of the problem, my knowledge of the environment, and my willingness to spend time and effort developing an instrument from something that looked useless. Most people look at a spoon and see a utensil, an instrument of eating. Billy looked at it long enough and thought hard enough and saw something else. What you have available to you is almost always more than it appears at first assessment. The limitation is usually not material. It's imagination and willingness to do the work. The physical work I was doing every day in that cell was not motivated by the knowledge that I'd need to climb a wall. I didn't know I'd need to climb a wall. I maintain my fitness because that's what you do, because your physical capability is yours. It belongs to you. It is one of the few things that cannot be taken from you as long as you keep working at it, and you do not know when you will need it. The day you need it and don't have it is the day the problem doesn't get solved. Every session I ran through in that cell was an investment in an outcome I couldn't specifically predict, but could generally anticipate. Volunteer for the difficult work before the difficult work becomes mandatory. That investment paid off on the wall. The 23 days I spent preparing before I attempted the main effort were not wasted days. Every one of those days I was gathering information, developing tools, rehearsing sequences, reading the environment, identifying the specific conditions that would make the attempt viable. Patience in this context is active work. It's the work of turning uncertainty into understanding and time into advantage. Never quit. Never quit gathering information, never quit developing capability, never quit working the problem. The man who tries to break out on day 2 is probably going to fail. The man who uses those days to understand exactly what he's facing, that man has a real shot. And Muhammad didn't know what he was getting into when he agreed to work with us years before. He knew it was risky, but he came through fast, clean, and at real personal risk to himself. The network of relationships you build with sources, with local partners, with people who trust you is a survival resource. You don't treat sources like instruments. You treat them like the human beings they are, and you hold up your end of that arrangement every time in every detail, because the day may come when your life depends on it. A concrete cell, 1 bucket, 1 cup, 1 spoon. That was the inventory. That was everything Billy had. And Billy walked out of there. Never tell me resources are the problem. Never tell me you don't have what you need. You have a brain. You have time. You have whatever is sitting in front of you right now that you haven't looked at hard enough yet. Look harder. Think longer. Prepare more thoroughly than seems necessary. Volunteer for everything. Never quit. Stay fit enough to go over the wall when the wall presents itself, because the wall will present itself and the question is whether you're ready. The Sudanese Military Intelligence Directorate spent resources and time detaining 1 man, conducting interrogations, running a security operation, and in the end, a man, a cup, a strip of shirt hem, and 1 bent spoon walked right out from under them. That's it. That's the lesson. The situation doesn't beat you. You beat the situation, or you let it beat you. Those are the only 2 options. There is no third. Never quit, never quit, never quit.